The Bermuda Triangle, that mysterious stretch of the Atlantic Ocean where ships and planes have disappeared inexplicably, has given rise to shocking stories. Here, we bring you 19 such accounts, some of which you will only hear on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications as we start with the first story of survival, the lone pilot. In December 1970, a pilot named Bruce Hernan lived an experience that would mark the rest of his life. An episode that defied all known laws of physics and air navigation. An experienced aviator who loved flying and knew the skies of South Florida well. Hernan's routine would change forever that day. He was piloting a BCFT Bonanza, a 36 light aircraft, accompanied by his father and a business partner, bound for Miami. They took off from Andros in the Bahamas around 3:00 p.m. The weather seemed ideal. Clear skies, light winds, and perfect visibility. Nothing on the horizon hinted at the strange phenomenon they were about to encounter. As Hernan climbed to about 3,000 feet, he spotted an unusual cloud shaped like a semicircle. It wasn't particularly alarming, as cumulus clouds often form in peculiar ways. But as he got closer, the cloud seemed to grow denser and more enveloping, almost as if it were alive, leaving him few options for maneuvering. Upon entering the cloud, Hernan immediately noticed something was wrong. The formation was much denser than normal, almost like an opaque fog, and the plane's instruments began to malfunction. The artificial horizon became useless, the altimeter fluctuated without explanation, and the compass spun wildly, as if the plane had lost all sense of direction. Hernan knew he had to stay calm. His experience as a pilot had taught him that disorientation in such conditions could be lethal. This wasn't just a cloud, it was something far stranger. As he moved deeper, the walls of the cloud seemed to spiral toward a central point, as if he were inside a tunnel. The walls appeared electrified, flashing with white and yellow lights that illuminated the cabin. Hernan would later describe the sensation as if time and space were distorted around him, with each passing second increasing his sense of unease. Though the engines were still running, the feeling of being trapped in a place where the normal rules of physics didn't apply was overwhelming. Radio communication with Miami's control tower only produced static. After what felt like endless minutes of uncertainty, Hernan finally saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Instinctively, he steered the plane toward it, pushing the engine to maximum power. As he emerged from the cloud, the outside world seemed to return abruptly to normal. The skies were clear, visibility was perfect, and the ocean stretched serenely below them. But something didn't add up. When they checked their position on the radar, Hernan realized they had traveled an impossible distance in an impossibly short time. The flight was supposed to take approximately 75 minutes, but they had arrived in Miami in just over 45 minutes. It was as if the plane had been propelled by an unknown force, traveling through space in a way that defied logic and navigation technology. Intrigued and disturbed by the experience, Hernan began to investigate. He consulted with physicists, meteorologists, and other pilots, but no one could offer a satisfactory explanation. Some suggested they may have passed through an atmospheric vortex, a rare alignment of weather conditions creating a high-speed wind tunnel. Others speculated an anomaly in the Earth's electromagnetic field, possibly related to the legendary Bermuda Triangle. Hernan, however, developed his own theory. He believed he had experienced what he called electronic fog, a phenomenon that could alter time and space. According to his hypothesis, this fog was made up of charged particles that interacted with the aircraft's electronics, causing instrument failures and allowing them to travel faster than usual. Over time, his story gained notoriety and became one of the most fascinating accounts of the Bermuda Triangle. While some dismissed it as a mere coincidence or miscalculation, Hernan always maintained that what he experienced was real. His experience not only changed his perspective on flight, but also on the mysteries of the universe. For him, that day in 1970 proved that there are still forces beyond our comprehension. Until the end of his days, Hernan continued to share his story, inspiring others to explore the Bermuda Triangle's mysteries and question the limits of science and reality. That lone pilot, faced with the unknown, had survived an experience that still intrigues people to this day. The Bermuda Triangle, that mysterious stretch of the Atlantic Ocean where ships and planes have disappeared inexplicably, has given rise to shocking stories. Here, we bring you 19 such accounts, some of which you will only hear on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications as we begin with the first story of survival, the lone pilot. In December 1970, Bruce Hernan, an experienced pilot who loved flying and knew the skies of South Florida well, had an encounter that would change his life forever, an episode that defied all known laws of physics and air navigation. On that day, he was piloting a BCFT Bonanza, a 36 light aircraft, with his father and a business partner, bound for Miami. They took off from Andros in the Bahamas at around 3:00 p.m. The weather was ideal, clear skies, light winds, and perfect visibility. Nothing on the horizon warned them of the strange phenomenon they were about to face. As Hernan climbed to about 3,000 feet, he spotted an unusual cloud in the shape of a semicircle. Initially, it wasn't alarming, as cumulus clouds often form in strange ways. But as he got closer, it grew denser and more enveloping, almost as if the cloud were alive and expanding in front of him, leaving him few options for maneuvering. Once inside, Hernan realized something was wrong. The cloud was much denser than normal, resembling an opaque fog. The plane's instruments began to malfunction. The artificial horizon became useless, the altimeter fluctuated for no reason, and the compass spun uncontrollably, as if the plane had lost all sense of direction. Hernan knew he had to remain calm. Disorientation could be lethal in these conditions, but this was no ordinary cloud. As he flew deeper, he noticed the walls of the cloud spiraled toward a central point, as if he were inside a tunnel. The walls seemed electrified, flashing white and yellow lights that illuminated the cabin. Hernan later described the sensation as if time and space were distorting around him, the tension growing with each passing second. Though the engines were still running, the feeling of being trapped in a place where the normal rules of physics didn't apply was overwhelming. Radio communication with Miami Control Tower produced only static. After what seemed like an eternity, Hernan saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Instinctively, he steered the plane toward it, pushing the engine to maximum power. As he emerged from the cloud, the world outside seemed to return to normal. The skies were clear, visibility perfect, and the ocean stretched serenely below them. However, something didn't add up. When they checked their position on the radar, Hernan realized they had traveled an impossible distance in a ridiculously short amount of time. The flight was supposed to take about 75 minutes, but they arrived in Miami in just over 45 minutes. It was as if the plane had been propelled by an unknown force, traveling faster than any known technology allowed. Intrigued and disturbed, Hernan began to investigate. He consulted with physicists, meteorologists, and other pilots, but no one could offer a satisfactory explanation. Some suggested they had passed through an atmospheric vortex, a rare alignment of weather conditions that creates a high-speed wind tunnel. Others speculated an anomaly in the Earth's electromagnetic field, possibly related to the Bermuda Triangle itself. Hernan developed his own theory. He believed he had experienced a phenomenon he called electronic fog, a charged particle field that could distort time and space. According to his hypothesis, the fog interacted with the plane's electronics, causing instrumental failures and allowing them to travel faster than should be possible. Over time, his story gained notoriety, becoming one of the most fascinating accounts of the Bermuda Triangle. Some considered it a true testimony to the anomalies reported in that region, while others dismissed it as a mere coincidence or miscalculation. Despite the doubts and skepticism, Hernan always maintained that what he experienced was real. His encounter changed not only his perspective on flight, but also his view on the mysteries of the universe. For him, that day in 1970 proved that there are forces beyond our comprehension. Until the end of his life, Hernan continued to share his story, inspiring others to explore the Bermuda Triangle's mysteries and question the boundaries of science and reality. The lone pilot, faced with the unknown, survived an experience that still intrigues people today. His story continues to spark curiosity and wonder, leaving a legacy that endures. Now, let's move on to the second story, the shadow on the radar. In the deep waters of the North Atlantic, where waves can rise like mountains in storms, strike with a ferocity that defies the bravest of men, the Atlantis III, a 25-meter fishing trawler, faced one of the strangest and most terrifying episodes of the last century. On that autumn night, the ocean seemed determined to reclaim its absolute dominion. Something much darker and more inexplicable lurked beneath the surface, marking the beginning of the nightmare. The Atlantis III had set sail from Reykjavik, Iceland, on a fishing expedition toward the rich cod grounds of the North Atlantic. Aboard were 12 seasoned crew members, hardened by years of battling the ocean. Captain Ezram, a veteran of the seas, helmed the trawler, which was well equipped for the typical challenges of the route. However, this voyage would not be like the others. On the fourth day at sea, weather reports warned of an unusually intense storm brewing about 50 nautical miles east of their position. Confident in the boat and crew, Captain Ezram decided to alter their course slightly south, hoping to avoid the worst of the storm. Little did they know, they were heading straight into something far more dangerous than fierce winds and towering waves. When the storm finally caught up with them, the Atlantis III was caught in its fury. The sky darkened and dense clouds seemed to merge with the ocean. The wind roared so loudly that communication became almost impossible, and the ship was tilted dangerously by the violent waves. One by one, the vessel's systems failed. First, the radio stopped transmitting, then the navigation instruments went haywire. In the midst of the chaos, the radar, still functioning, began to show something strange. Among the usual weather distortions, a dark shadow appeared on the screen. Initially, the crew thought it was just an anomalous echo caused by the storm, but soon it became clear that this wasn't the case. The shadow had a distinct shape and seemed to be approaching them slowly. First Officer Eric Lund was the first to notice the shadow's peculiar shape. It was neither round nor elongated. It looked like a set of long, slender limbs extending from a central body, resembling a giant squid. A crew member nervously joked that it was just a giant squid, but no one laughed. The shadow was too precise, too large. As the shadow drew closer, the crew began to hear a strange noise, a low, almost metallic hum emanating from deep below the ship. Then came the thumping. Something was hitting the underside of the Atlantis III, but it wasn't the waves. The men exchanged terrified glances, unable to comprehend what was happening. Suddenly, the ship tilted violently to one side, as though something enormous had pushed it from below. The crew screamed, clinging to whatever they could to avoid being swept into the ocean. Captain Ezram tried to regain control, but the engine started to fail. The radar now showed something even more horrifying. The dark shadow had moved beneath the ship, like a predator stalking its prey. Then the waves hit the deck with such force that 2 men were swept into the ocean. The others watched in helpless horror as they vanished into the raging waters. It was at this moment that some of the men claimed to have seen something rise from the depths, a dark, tentacle-like figure, briefly visible before sinking once again into the abyss. The Atlantis III was jolted by one final, monstrous blow, an impact so powerful that the crew thought the hull would split in two. The electrical systems failed completely, leaving the ship at the mercy of the ocean. As the storm began to subside a few hours later, only 7 men remained aboard. The others had either been swept away by the waves or had disappeared without a trace. The most bizarre part of the ordeal, according to the survivors, was what happened next. The shadow on the radar disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. The ocean, once violent, became unnervingly calm, as if something supernatural had taken control. The exhausted and traumatized men clung to the hope that someone would find them. 2 days later, a Norwegian freighter, the Arctic Vanguard, spotted their distress flare and rescued them. When they were finally brought aboard, the survivors were on the brink of physical and mental collapse. Although the crew of the Atlantis III had heard many terrifying stories about the sea, they had never encountered anything like this. The Atlantis III was eventually abandoned and left adrift, and days later, it was found partially sunk by a Coast Guard cutter. Strangely, there was no sign of external damage to explain the violent attack that the crew had described. The ship itself seemed intact, but its electronic systems were completely destroyed, as if exposed to a massive electrical shock. This mystery would grow into one of the most intriguing maritime legends of the century. Over the years, the story of the Atlantis III has fueled countless theories. Some suggest that the shadow on the radar was simply a weather anomaly, perhaps a combination of giant waves and equipment malfunction. Others speculate that the crew was the victim of an attack by a giant or unknown sea creature. The survivors, however, insist that what they experienced was no mere anomaly. Captain Ezram, in particular, was convinced that the shadow they saw was a living entity, something that lurked in the ocean's depths, seldom seen by human eyes. To this day, the story of the Atlantis III remains one of the most chilling mysteries of the sea, a reminder that, even in an age of advanced technology, the ocean still holds secrets we cannot comprehend. The Crystal Island, in the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, where the waves conceal secrets that seem to date back to the dawn of time, strange and inexplicable stories have emerged. One of the most captivating of these is the tale of Henry Dorset, an English sailor. Dorset's story, which dates back to 1926, is one of the most enduring and intriguing maritime legends. According to his account, he witnessed something no one else had ever seen, an island submerged beneath the water, a place that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. Henry Dorset was a 35-year-old seaman with over a decade of sailing experience. He had worked on merchant and fishing vessels, building a reputation as a reliable and skilled sailor. In 1926, he boarded the SS Curragh, a freighter transporting goods from Liverpool to the West Indies. The journey began without incident, with clear skies and favorable winds. However, everything changed when they neared Bermuda. Out of nowhere, an unexpected storm formed, catching the crew by surprise. The winds howled as if determined to tear the sails, and the waves rose like towering walls, battering the ship's hull. The situation worsened when one of the Curragh's boilers exploded, leaving the vessel adrift. The storm ultimately capsized the ship, and many of the crew were thrown into the sea. Dorset, clinging to a piece of wood, was one of the few to survive the initial sinking. The storm continued to rage for hours, and he struggled against the waves, exhausted and on the verge of unconsciousness. Finally, the storm passed, and the sea became eerily calm. Floating in the vast, empty ocean, Dorset had no idea what awaited him at dawn on the third day. As the sun began to rise, Dorset first thought the glimmers he saw were merely reflections on the ocean's surface. But as he drew closer, he realized it was something more, something submerged just beneath the water. What he discovered was an island, but not just any island. This one seemed to be made entirely of glass, with angular shapes and shiny surfaces that reflected the sunlight in a mesmerizing way. The island was surrounded by a bluish glow that illuminated the water around it, giving it an otherworldly appearance. The shapes beneath the surface appeared to be artificial, as though they had been constructed by human hands, or perhaps by something far older and unknown. Fascinated and terrified at once, Dorset was carried toward the island by the currents. He hoped to find a place to rest and perhaps some sign of life. But when he reached the edge, he discovered that the island was not solid like rock. It had dents in its surface and was made of a transparent, shimmering material similar to glass or quartz, but more resilient. Despite its slippery surface, he was able to walk on it. Though the island lacked vegetation, streams of fresh water flowed from small crevices in the structure, which enabled Dorset to survive. He lived off the fish he could catch in the surrounding waters. While he never saw any land animals, the waters around the island were unusually rich in marine life, brightly colored fish of shapes he had never encountered before. However, it was at night that the island's true mystery began to unfold. As the sun set, the island began to glow more intensely. Dorset described the light as complex patterns running across its surface, almost like circuits being activated by the darkness. The glow was both beautiful and unsettling, reminding him of ancient writings he had seen about lost civilizations. At night, Dorset also heard faint, almost imperceptible vibrations, as though they were coming from deep within the island. He never saw anyone else, but despite his fear, he had no choice but to stay and wait for rescue. Over time, he began to experience strange visions. Often, when he looked at the water around the island, he would see shadows moving beneath the surface, not fish, but large, elongated shapes, as though enormous creatures were swimming in the depths below. Then, one night, while resting in a secluded corner of the island, Dorset had an experience that would haunt him for the rest of his life. According to his account, a humanoid figure briefly emerged from the water. It was not fully human, though. The figure had an unsettling, almost alien appearance, something other than human, yet not entirely monstrous either. The figure Henry Dorset saw on the island had translucent skin that glowed in the light of the mysterious island, and large, dark eyes that seemed to watch him with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. The figure did not speak or make any aggressive movements. It simply gazed at him for a few seconds before submerging once again beneath the water. From that moment on, Dorset felt an unshakable sense that the island was not a natural place. Something, or someone, had created it, and he was intruding upon a space that did not belong to him. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The rescue. After what Dorset estimated to be 3 weeks on the island, a steamer called the SS Mariner passed by his location. Using a makeshift torch made from wood and cloth, he managed to attract the attention of the crew, and they rescued him, barely conscious, dehydrated, and delirious. When he told his story to the crew of the Mariner, he was met with skepticism. Some of the sailors mentioned that they had indeed noticed a strange glow beneath the water as they sailed near the location where Dorset had been found. However, when they returned to the area to investigate, the island was gone, vanished without a trace. Back on the mainland, Dorset tried to have his story taken seriously. He recounted his experience to scientists, explorers, and sailors, but most dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by hunger, thirst, and isolation. Others suggested it might have been bioluminescent coral or some other illusion caused by underwater gases. Yet, Dorset was adamant that what he had seen was real. In the years that followed, several expeditions tried to locate the Crystal Island, but no evidence of its existence was ever found. The legend of Henry Dorset and the island persisted, however, fueling theories about lost civilizations, advanced technologies, and unknown creatures that might inhabit the ocean's depths. His story became an unsolved enigma, and over time, it became one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime lore. Dorset spent the rest of his life quietly, away from the sea. Though he often spoke of his experience, he could never fully explain what he had seen. For him, the Crystal Island remained a stark reminder that the world is much vaster and stranger than we could ever imagine, a place where the impossible can become real. The Ghost Ship. Moving on to another strange and terrifying tale of the sea, we come to the Lady Grass, a luxury yacht that disappeared without a trace in 1947. Her story, a mystery that defies logic, is one that leaves more questions than answers. The Lady Grass was a private yacht owned by Richard Winthrop, a wealthy American businessman. It was designed for long Atlantic crossings and was known in high society as a symbol of wealth and sophistication. The yacht had an experienced crew, including Captain Samuel Colt, a seasoned sailor with decades of experience. In the spring of 1947, the Lady Grass embarked on its final voyage, leaving New York for Lisbon, Portugal. The voyage began smoothly, with sunny skies and favorable winds, but as they ventured further into the Atlantic, strange events began to unfold. The storm. On the third day of their journey, an unpredictable storm suddenly formed. It was no ordinary storm, but a magnetic one, which disrupted both the yacht's electrical systems and navigational instruments. The winds whipped the yacht with fury, and the waves sent the vessel in erratic directions. Despite Captain Colty's best efforts to maintain control, the conditions worsened by the hour. The crew's behavior became increasingly erratic, as though something had affected their minds. The last communication they made with the control tower was a chilling distress signal. "We're losing course. The systems are failing. The storm. It's like it isn't real. Please help us." After that transmission, the Lady Grass disappeared. The return of the ghost ship. Weeks later, on June 16, 1947, a Portuguese fishing vessel, Santa Maria, spotted a yacht floating aimlessly off the coast of the Azores, a region known for its unpredictable weather and dangerous waters. As they cautiously approached, the crew was stunned to see that it was the Lady Grass, intact, but completely unmanned. What really puzzled the crew was the evidence of recent life on board. When they boarded the yacht, they found a cup of coffee still hot on the table in the yacht's living room. Cigarettes were burning slowly in an ashtray. In the captain's cabin, a half-written letter was found on the desk, and on the dining table, a half-eaten meal sat untouched, the food still hot on the plates. Yet, there was no sign of anyone on board. The Santa Maria's crew searched the yacht meticulously, but found no trace of the passengers or crew. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, nothing. The yacht was completely empty, yet it was clear that people had been on board recently. It was as if the ship's daily activities had been violently interrupted, but without any signs of conflict. The survivor? 3 days after the Lady Grass was discovered, a Portuguese sailor named Esteban Silva was rescued from the nearby waters. Silva claimed to have been one of the few survivors of the storm that had struck the Lady Grass. According to Silva, the events leading up to the yacht's disappearance were even stranger than anyone could have imagined. Silva recounted that, just before the storm, the crew had started to behave strangely, almost as though they were being influenced by some outside force. He remembered a strange, oppressive feeling in the air, a presence on board that made the crew restless and agitated. He spoke of a glowing light on the horizon, which seemed to have drawn the crew toward it, against their will. The details of Silva's story were chilling, but he was unable to explain what happened to the Lady Grass or its crew. As with many ghost ship legends, the mystery of the Lady Grass left more questions than answers. Had the crew fallen victim to some unknown phenomenon or force, or had something else taken place aboard that yacht? The answer, like so many stories of the sea, remains elusive. The Lady Grass, disintegration and disappearance. The magnetic storm that struck the Lady Grass had not only wreaked havoc on the ship's systems, but also seemed to have catastrophic effects on the minds of the crew. Esteban Silva, the survivor, described how the storm caused both crew members and passengers to behave erratically, as if they were under some kind of trance. Silva recounted a chilling event. As the storm intensified, the crew members began to disintegrate before his very eyes. It was not a normal death, Silva said. I saw my shipmates crumbling into fragments, as if the storm itself was disintegrating them. Like their bodies were turned into dust in the air. They just vanished. Silva was swept away into the sea, and after a harrowing experience, he ended up aboard the Santa Maria. Days later, Silva could never explain what had happened with certainty. However, his testimony aligned with the theories of some experts, who later speculated that the storm might have caused an accelerated decomposition phenomenon, or some form of unexplained dematerialization. Over time, researchers have suggested that the storm may have been related to a natural phenomenon not yet understood, something akin to a magnetic anomaly that could have structured the atoms or particles that make up physical matter. Despite numerous investigations carried out by several governments and scientific agencies, including efforts by the U.S. Navy and the Portuguese Army, the case of the Lady Grass has never been definitively solved. All attempts at finding answers ended in dead ends. The testimony of the survivors and the reports of experts seemed to point to an impossible conclusion. Lady Grass had been the victim of something far beyond the current limits of science. In later years, some speculated that the storm might have been caused by a secret military test, an experiment related to weather control or the manipulation of magnetic fields. Others theorized that a magnetic storm of immense proportions could have affected not only the physical matter of the yacht but also human perception, warping reality itself. However, the Lady Grass and her crew were never seen again. The yacht was lost to the ocean, and no one else has encountered a storm of such a bizarre nature. The Lady Grass became a legend, told among sailors and adventurers in hushed whispers with a mixture of awe and terror. Today, more than 70 years later, the story remains unresolved, and the disappearance of the ship and its occupants is one of the most disturbing mysteries in the history of maritime exploration. What really happened that fateful night in 1947? Was the magnetic storm a natural anomaly or a secret experiment gone wrong? No one knows for certain. The Lady Grass remains a shadow on the sea, a ghost ship that should never have existed, its story buried in the depths of the ocean. Flight 19, the Lost Squadron. Now, let's delve into another mystery, this time from the sky, the enigmatic case of Flight 19. The sky, vast and mysterious, gives us a sense of freedom, but also conceals dark secrets that can't always be understood. Some events in its immensity are so strange and disconcerting that they defy logic, crumbling the certainties of science. One such event is the case of Flight 19, a training mission carried out in 1945 that ended with the inexplicable disappearance of 5 U.S. Navy planes. Flight 19 became one of the most puzzling mysteries of the 20th century, a tale that still captures the collective imagination, fed by theories, legends, and testimonies that provoke both astonishment and disbelief. The training mission. On December 5, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger fighter planes, part of the 19th Squadron of the United States Navy, took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The mission was a routine navigation training exercise, nothing out of the ordinary. The planes, each piloted by a trained aviator and accompanied by a second crew member, were tasked with flying a simple course in the Atlantic Ocean, marking a round-trip route. The leader of the formation was Lieutenant Charles Taylor, a highly experienced aviator with over 2,000 hours of flight time. The 5 planes were equipped with communication radios to maintain constant contact with the control tower and other aircraft in the area. The mission was expected to last just 2 hours, and there was nothing to suggest that anything could go wrong. The disorienting start. As the mission progressed, the planes began to encounter unusual problems. The first indication that something was amiss came when one of the planes, flying in the rear of the formation, reported losing reference to its heading. Soon, all the aircraft experienced similar issues with their compasses and navigation systems. The pilots found themselves unable to determine their exact location. Lieutenant Taylor, with his vast experience, tried to regain control of the situation. However, the problems only intensified. Pilots began to report that they could not locate the ocean or the coastline, even though they should have been able to do so based on their planned route. What was supposed to be a simple training mission had taken an inexplicable turn. The final communications. According to radio reports, Taylor seemed increasingly confused as the situation worsened. In his last communication, he stated, "Everything is wrong. We can't see. Nothing. We are lost." Then Flight 19 vanished from radar. The control tower tried to contact the planes several times, but there was no response. At 19 o'clock hours, a search mission was launched to locate the missing planes. However, no trace of them was found. The search continued for days, but not a single piece of debris, a body, or any sign of the planes or their pilots was recovered. The disappearance of the rescue plane. What made the disappearance of Flight 19 even more bizarre was the subsequent vanishing of a PBM Mariner rescue plane sent to search for them. According to Navy reports, the rescue plane disappeared without a trace while flying over the same sector where Flight 19 had gone missing. The search was intensified, but no wreckage was ever found. The planes had vanished into the ocean as if they had never existed. Theories and legends. The disappearance of Flight 19 became one of the most emblematic cases in aviation history, one of the most baffling disappearances the world has ever known. More than 70 years later, the case continues to be the subject of theories, speculation, and mysteries. Among the most intriguing elements that have fueled the legend of Flight 19 is the testimony of a supposed survivor. According to his account, one of the pilots of Flight 19 had parachuted out of his plane before it disappeared. This man, whose identity was never officially confirmed, added an eerie twist to the story. In his version, the pilots had not only experienced failures in their navigation systems, but they also reported a strange disturbance in the airspace. Before they became disoriented, all the pilots witnessed a bright light that appeared suddenly in the sky. The light seemed to move erratically, illuminating the entire sky. The strange light caused the pilots to experience unsettling sensations, Some reported severe headaches, while others described a feeling of temporary paralysis, as though something was interfering with their bodies and minds. This element of the bright light is a key part of the Flight 19 legend, and it has been woven into various theories about the disappearance. Some suggest it might have been caused by a weather anomaly or even an extraterrestrial encounter, while others speculate it was an event related to military testing, like secret weather manipulation or electromagnetic disruptions. The unsolved mystery. Today, the mystery of Flight 19 remains one of the most perplexing disappearances in aviation history. Despite numerous investigations, no concrete answers have emerged. The planes and their crew were lost without a trace, and no one has been able to explain the strange events that led to their disappearance. As time passes, the legend of Flight 19 endures, leaving behind only questions and a sense of eerie fascination. The incident is often linked to the Bermuda Triangle, a region notorious for unexplained disappearances, though no definitive connection has ever been proven. For now, the fate of Flight 19 remains an unsolved enigma, one of the many dark secrets hidden within the vastness of the sky. The survivor of Flight 19, a mysterious encounter. The survivor of Flight 19, who claimed to have been in one of the tailplanes, provided a chilling account of what transpired after the planes began to lose control. As he parachuted from his plane to avoid disintegration, he could see how the other aircraft began to plummet rapidly. Meanwhile, the strange lights, which had been moving erratically in the sky, continued to hover ominously above. Descending through the air, the survivor claimed that he saw a formation of lights in the sky, something that resembled a portal or atmospheric distortion. As he finally landed on an uninhabited island, he couldn't remember exactly how he managed to touch down, but he was certain that the lights he witnessed before jumping played a critical role in his survival. When he was eventually rescued by a team, the man was found to be deeply disoriented and affected by the events he had witnessed. His testimony was met with a mixture of skepticism and belief, depending on who you asked. Some thought he had experienced a psychological breakdown caused by the traumatic event, while others considered that he might have encountered an unexplained phenomenon, one that was beyond the comprehension of modern science. His story, combined with the strange events of Flight 19, continues to fuel theories about otherworldly or paranormal interference with aircraft, raising questions about whether the strange lights and sensory anomalies could have been responsible for the disorientation and eventual disappearance of the planes. The Argo incident echoes in the deep. In 1972, the vast and mysterious ocean was the setting for one of the most disturbing events in underwater exploration, the Argo incident. The story begins when a research submarine called the Argo, part of the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, picked up an odd sonar signal during a routine mission in the North Atlantic. The crew, led by Commander Richard Palmer, was tasked with exploring marine ecosystems and studying the underwater geology of the region. Everything seemed ordinary as the team conducted their research in a largely unexplored area of the Atlantic. But on December 13, 1972, something entirely unexpected occurred: the sonar anomaly. As the Argo dove deeper into the ocean, it detected strange sonar echoes at a depth of about 300 meters, 1,000 feet, signals that seemed to originate from a submerged structure. This anomaly didn't match any previously mapped shipwrecks, and Commander Palmer made the decision to investigate further. As the Argo descended, the sonar readings became more intense, indicating the presence of something large below. When they reached the coordinates, the team was shocked to find what appeared to be a luxury ship, likely from the mid-20th century, resting on the seabed. The ship was badly disintegrated and covered by years of sediment, yet certain parts of it appeared unusually intact, almost as if they had been preserved by an unknown force. But what truly stunned the crew was the strange sonar echoes they continued to pick up. These echoes didn't correspond to typical wreckage, but seemed to interact with the submarine's sonar system as though something was deliberately responding to their presence. The discovery of the survivors. The crew of the Argo continued their investigation for several more days, and on December 18, a discovery that would further deepen the mystery occurred. As the submarine approached the wreck, the sonar unexpectedly detected signs of life, something that had never been recorded in that area before. The Argo ascended slowly, and as it neared the surface, a small lifeboat was spotted adrift in the water. The crew approached the boat, only to find three disoriented survivors: Captain John Harris, Dr. Emily Grant, and Engineer Paul Nishi. They appeared to be the only survivors of some sort of disaster. The trio was exhausted, disoriented, and confused, unable to recall how they had ended up in the lifeboat or how they had survived at sea. Fragmented testimonies. Once aboard the Argo, the survivors began to share their fragmented accounts. Although their memories were fuzzy and inconsistent, none of them could recall the exact details of the wreck. Captain Harris spoke first, describing how his team had been working on a scientific project at an offshore oil platform located several hundred kilometers from shore. They had been at sea for weeks, but an unexpected and violent storm caught them off guard as they attempted to relocate to a safer location. According to Harris, the storm was brutal, and before they could react, their boat sank in minutes. "The sea swallowed us up," Harris said. "The last thing I remember was struggling to stay afloat, and then everything went black." The voices in the water, but it was Dr. Emily Grant's testimony that sent chills down the spines of the Argo crew. According to her, while stranded in the water, she had heard voices, not human voices, but soft, whisper-like sounds. She couldn't see anyone, but the whispers felt warm, as if guiding her. "It was as if they were calling me," she explained, "telling me not to be afraid, that we would survive, that we were not alone." Engineer Paul Nishi corroborated Dr. Grant's account, adding that he, too, heard the same voices. "It was like someone was guiding us," he said. "We heard them telling us to go towards the light, to the surface, to keep going." The survivors described how these voices directed them towards a specific point in the ocean, a direction they followed without question. It was as if the voices were urging them to stay hopeful, to keep moving toward the light, toward survival. Though they couldn't explain it, their survival instinct and the mysterious guidance they received kept them alive. The mystery deepens. When the crew of the Argo analyzed the survivors' testimonies, they were perplexed. The reports of voices could not be dismissed, but they couldn't be easily explained either. Some speculated that the survivors had been affected by sensory deprivation, exhaustion, or even hallucinations induced by the traumatic experience. Yet, the consistency of their testimonies, especially the specific details of the whispers, left many of the crew members convinced that something more extraordinary had occurred. What made the situation even more disturbing was that according to the Argo's sonar readings, there was no sign of any other human activity in the area. No other ships, no other survivors, and no other vessels in distress were detected by the submarine's instruments. The unsolved mystery. The Argo incident remains one of the most baffling and eerie cases in underwater exploration. Despite extensive efforts to investigate the wreckage, the voices and strange sonar anomalies were never fully explained. The discovery of the survivors, who seem to have been guided by an unseen force, continues to fuel speculation that something beyond our understanding is at play in the deep ocean. Could the voices have been some kind of supernatural phenomenon? Were they a product of the crew's collective stress and sensory overload? Or was there a deeper, more unexplainable connection between the survivors and the strange shipwreck they encountered? The Argo incident remains unsolved to this day, and it stands as one of the ocean's most haunting mysteries, an echo in the sonar that, much like the sea itself, may never be fully understood. The voices of the deep, the enigma of the Argo incident. The Argo incident remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in underwater exploration. Following the rescue of 3 survivors from a shipwreck, Commander Richard Palmer and his crew discovered sonar anomalies that left them unnerved. After bringing the survivors aboard the Argo, the crew noticed strange sonar patterns emanating from the same direction where they had just surfaced. These echoes didn't seem to match the typical patterns of underwater wreckage or natural phenomena. Instead, they suggested an entity or force actively interacting with the submarine's sonar system. What puzzled the team even further was that the survivors, Captain John Harris, Dr. Emily Grant, and engineer Paul Mishi described hearing mysterious voices while stranded in the water. The voices were not human, but soft whispers that seemed to guide them toward safety, urging them to move in a specific direction. The survivors' testimonies were vague, but consistent enough to spark speculation that something beyond human comprehension might have been involved. Some believed the voices were the result of psychological effects brought on by the trauma, while others suggested the possibility of a supernatural or mystical phenomenon. The sonar anomalies, along with the survivors' shared experience of hearing voices, only deepened the mystery. Despite extensive research, no scientific explanation has been found that adequately explains the strange phenomena surrounding the Argo incident. As for the voices themselves, some have theorized that they could be the result of a natural resonance in the ocean, while others propose paranormal or extraterrestrial involvement. The incident remains an unsolved mystery, with the ocean's depths guarding its secrets as the eerie echoes of those whispers continue to haunt the memories of those involved. The Woman of the Tides, a tale from the deep. The story of Sarah Reynolds, the Tidewater Woman, emerged in 1983 as one of the most unusual and mystifying incidents ever reported in maritime history. After surviving a devastating shipwreck, Sarah's story of encountering a fish-tailed woman in the depths of the Atlantic has captivated the imaginations of many, even as it defies logical explanation. On July 3, 1983, the yacht Diana II, carrying Sarah and several others, set sail from the coast of South Charleston, bound for the Bahamas. What began as a relaxing vacation quickly turned disastrous when an unexpected storm erupted, throwing massive waves that ripped apart the yacht's hull. As the yacht sank, Sarah clung to a piece of debris, struggling to stay afloat amidst the chaos. She was ultimately swept into the whirlpool of the storm, disappearing beneath the waves. The Woman with the Fish Tail. The story of Sarah Reynolds, a woman who encountered a mysterious figure with a fish tail, has sparked intense debates among scientists and experts. Some specialists claim that her experience was induced by sensory deprivation or extreme dehydration, while others proposed a spiritual or supernatural explanation. Dr. Lucas Thompson, the leading scientist who treated Sarah, pointed out that this was a unique case that defied logic and suggested a deeper connection beyond what we know about the ocean. Over the years, various theories have emerged regarding the woman with the fish tail. One of the most popular is that Sarah's encounter was a psychological manifestation of her desperation in isolation, possibly triggered by prolonged exposure to the sun. Others suggested that the figure could have been a nymph or sea creature from a different plane of existence, a connection to the mystique surrounding the ocean. A less orthodox theory posits that the fish-tailed woman was an interdimensional entity, guiding those on the edge of the ocean. Despite scientific attempts to explain the event, Sarah's story remains an enigma. Critical voices insisted it was a result of sensory deprivation and extreme stress, but the intensity and coherence of her experience cannot be easily dismissed. The mystery has had a lasting impact on Sarah and those who seek to understand the ocean's secrets. The Woman with the Fish Tail has come to symbolize the magical, almost mythical side of the ocean, inspiring both scientists and dreamers alike to imagine hidden worlds beneath the sea where magic and science intersect. The Lost Patrol. In 1968, a squadron of 6 fighter planes vanished during a routine training mission over the Atlantic Ocean. Days later, one pilot, Captain Robert Bob Daniels, was found on a deserted island seemingly unharmed, but with a story that defied belief. His strange claims about portals in the sky sparked widespread speculation, ranging from a plane crash to a paranormal event. The 33rd Squadron took off from Andrews Air Base for a high-altitude training mission. As they flew over the Atlantic, an unexpected thunderstorm broke, darkening the sky and disrupting the plane's navigation systems. Despite being accustomed to adverse conditions, the storm intensified, dragging the squadron into its center. The last communications from Captain Daniels mentioned seeing something strange in the sky before all contact was lost. The storm dissipated, but there was no sign of the planes or wreckage. A massive search was launched, but nothing was found. Weeks later, A fishing boat discovered a small, damaged motorboat off a remote Caribbean island. To their astonishment, Captain Daniels was aboard, in excellent physical condition, but mentally altered. He spoke of seeing portals in the sky, describing them as tunnels of light, not like lightning but something different, a doorway to another place. As time passed, Daniels became obsessed with his memories of the storm, insisting that the other planes were trapped in that place through the portal, though not dead. His accounts led to various theories. Some believed the storm caused a rift in space-time, transporting the squadron to a parallel dimension, while others thought Daniels had suffered from stress-induced hallucinations. Some even speculated that the event could have been the result of a secret military experiment gone wrong. Regardless of the theories, the truth behind the disappearance remains a mystery. The flight logs were destroyed, and the other pilots were never found. The story of the Lost Patrol continues to live on, with Daniel's words echoing the idea that there is something in the sky beyond human comprehension, waiting to be discovered, the forgotten captain. The vast and mysterious sea has long been the setting for countless legends and tales that defy logic and human comprehension. Among these, one story stands out as an enduring mystery, the story of the forgotten captain. This is the tale of Captain Henry McAllister, a seasoned captain of a cargo ship, who woke up one day to find himself in a nightmarish scenario. His ship had disappeared without a trace, and although he thought he had been asleep for only a few hours, time had passed in an inexplicable way. Weeks had gone by, though he had no memory of it. The story begins with disorientation, but soon deepens into a strange enigma involving time, space, and the very nature of reality itself. The Oceana, a medium-sized cargo ship, was built in 1958 and designed to transport heavy goods along the east coast of the United States and South America. It was an ideal vessel for the task, and Captain McAllister, a man in his 40s with more than 20 years of experience, was known for his calm and decisive leadership. On the night of May 10, 1972, the Oceana was on a routine voyage to Miami. The skies were clear, and the sailors were resting in their cabins. Captain McAllister was in his office reviewing the voyage reports. Everything seemed normal, but at midnight, something unusual occurred. As the ship passed near a small, uninhabited island in the Bahamas, an alien rumble shook the hull of the ship. The rudder swerved on its own, and the ship's course changed inexplicably. The officers on watch were unable to stop it, and moments later, a violent storm hit, unexpected and far beyond a typical tropical or summer storm. Lightning flashed erratically, and the waves crashed against the ship with terrifying force. The sailors, used to rough seas, scrambled to secure the cargo and keep the ship steady. But then, just as suddenly, the storm ceased. The waters calmed, and the sky cleared as if the storm had never happened. McAllister, who had been awakened by the commotion, was growing increasingly bewildered. The helm remained unresponsive, and when he ordered the ship to stop, the crew discovered the navigation instruments were failing, the compass erratic. Before he could take further action, McAllister fell into a deep, trance-like sleep. He wasn't exhausted or tired, he simply fell into a heavy slumber, as though some unknown force had put him under. When he awoke, the room was dark and silent. For a moment, he was disoriented. Looking at the clock, he saw it was 10:30 a.m., but the clock had stopped. Out the window, the sea was calm, but the horizon seemed distant, and there were no signs of other ships or land. McAllister quickly left his cabin, heading to the bridge, where he found it deserted. The helm was in neutral, and all instruments were dead. The ship was entirely alone. As he investigated, he found that the Oceana had completely strayed from its course. The area of the ocean where it was located didn't match the planned route. It was miles from any known coast and not on any map. Determined to find answers, McAllister searched the ship for signs of his crew. What he found was chilling. The sailors' cabins were empty, the galley tables set as if the crew had been interrupted mid-meal, but there was no trace of anyone. On the bridge, he discovered a letter signed by a man he didn't recognize. It was addressed to him, and as he read it, the horror of what had occurred became clear. The letter said, "It has been weeks since we last had contact. The ocean has disappeared in a freak storm, and we don't know what happened. We believe we have been taken to another place, another time. The waves are no longer what they were. Please, if you read this, don't keep searching for answers. There are no answers. We are all lost. McAllister tried to make sense of the letter. How could the ship have been taken to another time or place? Was it possible? But deep down, something urged him to believe what he was reading. Disoriented and desperate for answers, McAllister continued his search, but there was still no sign of the crew. Strange phenomena began to occur, shadows moving at the edge of his vision, murmurs of conversation when no one was around. He began to doubt his sanity. Was it all a hallucination, or was there something deeper at play? Something that defied everything he knew about the sea, time, and reality. After weeks without direction or contact, McAllister finally spotted land, a small, remote fishing port he had never seen before. Desperate, he steered the ship toward shore, and upon landing, he was greeted by local fishermen. But when McAllister shared his story, the fishermen shocked him with a revelation. The port he had landed at had been abandoned for over 20 years. The maps they showed him contained no reference to either the ship or the island. The fishermen also told him that in the past decade, there had been rumors of missing ships and people returning from strange, unexplained places. Yet none of them had heard of the Oceana or its mysterious disappearance. When McAllister returned to civilization, he was forever changed. The man who had set sail was no longer the same. His memory of the events during those days at sea had vanished like a forgotten dream. But something inside him remained, a certainty that the sea had reclaimed his ship, and that time itself had played a cruel game with him. The story of the forgotten captain was never solved, and the Oceana remains a shadow on the ocean, whispered about by sailors in taverns and on the docks. Captain McAllister never ceased to believe that somewhere in the vast ocean, time and space twist in ways our minds cannot comprehend. Silent Lightning, Chapter 1, The Beginning. It was a bright summer evening in 1996 when the sailing ship Ilium set sail from the port of Key West, Florida. Captain David Joey, an experienced 42-year-old sailor, stood at the helm, watching the horizon with a mixture of tranquility and curiosity. The crew of 4 was ready for a 2-week crossing of the Atlantic, a voyage that was meant to be just another routine journey across warm, calm waters. Their objective was simple: to sail along the coast, explore little-known islands, and enjoy the solitude of the sea. Nothing could have warned them of the strange events that awaited. The Ilium was a 14-meter sailboat, painted in immaculate white with navy blue accents. Elegant and sturdy, she was built to withstand even the most violent storms. The crew consisted of David, his trusted first mate Peter Williams, and 3 young sailors, Sarah, a marine biologist on her first long voyage, and siblings Lucas and Naomi, experienced Caribbean sailors. Despite their varying personalities, they all shared a deep passion for the sea and confidence in their sailing abilities. The skies were clear, and the waters of the Atlantic sparkled beneath the bright sun. The wind was steady, and the sailboat moved forward smoothly. However, as the sun began to set, something began to change. Clouds gathered ominously on the horizon, forming a dark wall that advanced rapidly from the east. Sarah, who was observing the sea through binoculars, noticed that something was off. The air had grown thick, and the horizon darkened in mere minutes, as though the day was ending with a single violent blow. The steady wind calmed as if nature itself was holding its breath. She turned to David. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice tight. David, who had been adjusting the sails, looked up at the approaching storm. "We're in for a storm," he said, unconcerned. Storms like this were common at sea. Chapter 2. The Storm Without Sound. That night, the first signs of the storm began. The sea churned slightly, but the wind remained still. The crew began to prepare the sailboat for what seemed like an ordinary storm. But as the sailboat moved forward, something more unsettling began to happen. The rain began to fall torrentially, but the strangest thing was that no thunder could be heard. Lightning flashed across the sky, yet there was no accompanying roar of thunder. The silence was eerie, as if the storm existed without sound. The crew, already unsettled, found themselves completely bewildered. The alien was tossed about by increasingly powerful waves, but the silence was the most disturbing part. David, pale-faced, tried to maintain control of the rudder with trembling hands. "This isn't normal," he muttered to himself. He tried to communicate by radio, but static blocked any response. The storm seemed to have destroyed all communication with the outside world. "We're trapped," Naomi shouted, pointing into the dark sea, which seemed to approach them with unnatural speed. The water moved strangely, curving in unusual patterns, but the phenomenon didn't end there. Chapter 3. Figures Under the Water. As the storm intensified, Sarah stood at the bow, searching for any sign of land or a change in the weather. Suddenly, something caught her attention in the distance, a bright series of lights glowing from beneath the water. "There! Do you see that?" she exclaimed, pointing out to sea. David, still struggling with the rudder, followed her gaze. What he saw froze his blood. In the dark waters of the Atlantic, a series of lights shimmered, moving beneath the surface. They weren't fish. They were shapes, human-like figures that appeared to be swimming at great speed. Some of the figures were large, others small, but all moved in perfect order, as though following a precise course. "What the hell is that?" Peter asked, approaching the bow after hearing Sarah's scream. "That's not natural," David said, his voice tight. "It's not fish. It's lights. Some kind of underwater phenomenon." Sarah was mesmerized by the sight, but soon realized the glowing figures weren't fading. They were moving closer, too close. The figures seemed solid, gliding just below the water's surface like shadows, slipping silently through the depths. Chapter 4. The Rescue. The storm continued its relentless assault, but the silence was still absolute. The wind and rain battered the sailboat with frightening force, yet there was no thunder or the usual roar of the sea that accompanies violent storms. The crew was paralyzed by fear as the luminous figures approached the helium. An indescribable dread filled the air, and no one dared speak aloud. The collective thought among the crew was clear. Something was terribly wrong. As if the atmosphere itself had become dense and suffocating, the pressure in their heads intensified. It was as though an invisible force was manipulating the space around them. Then a new threat emerged. A lightning bolt struck so close that it illuminated the sea and the sky with blinding intensity. For a few seconds, the crew was completely blinded. When their vision returned, they realized the helium had been shifted off course. The last memory before they lost consciousness was the sound of an engine in the distance, followed by an eerie silence. When the crew awoke, they found themselves aboard another ship, a rescue vessel, the Bent, which had responded to their emergency call. The crew of the Bent was unable to explain how the helium had gotten so far off course or how it had survived the storm with no apparent damage. What puzzled the rescuers even more was the state of the helium's crew. They were exhausted, but none showed physical injury. Yet, the stories they told of the soundless storm, the glowing figures, and the strange pressure in the air confused everyone who heard them. Chapter 5. The Mystery Never Solved. Though the helium crew was rescued and returned to shore, the story of the silent storm and the mysterious glowing figures never faded from their minds. Despite their attempts to resume normal lives, the memory of what they had experienced haunted them. David Joy and his crew could never explain it. Was it a natural phenomenon? An encounter with something beyond human understanding? No one could say for certain, but what united them in their experience was an unwavering certainty. The lights they saw beneath the water were real, not a figment of imagination or madness. Years passed, but the mystery of the luminous figures remained unsolved. The sea, as always, jealously guarded its secrets, and the story of the helium became one of many mysterious tales whispered among sailors. The survivors never forgot the presence of those lights beneath the water, a chilling reminder that the depths of the ocean hold mysteries that even the most seasoned sailors cannot comprehend. Chapter 1. The Departure. The sun shone brightly over the Pacific Ocean as the Mariner 2, a sleek modern tourist cruise ship, set sail from the port of Los Angeles on the morning of May 14, 1997. This luxury ship, equipped with every imaginable amenity, was designed to provide the ultimate vacation experience. Infinity edge pools, spas, high-end restaurants, and panoramic terraces offering 360 views of the ocean. It was the perfect vessel for a week-long cruise along the Californian coastline. The passengers were a mix of families, couples, and groups of friends, all seeking relaxation and adventure. On the bridge, Captain Victor Alvarez and his crew made final adjustments, preparing to embark on another routine voyage. Captain Alvarez was an experienced sailor, respected both by his crew and passengers. Among the passengers was Emma, a middle-aged woman traveling alone to escape the grind of her everyday life. Daniel and Laura, a young couple on their honeymoon, and a group of friends reuniting for a special occasion. No one could have foreseen the strange events that would unfold over the coming days. During the first few hours of the cruise, everything was perfect. The calm waters, the soothing sound of waves lapping against the hull, friendly conversations at the restaurants, and the breathtaking ocean views all combined to create an idyllic experience. For many aboard, it felt like a dream come true, far from the worries of the world. However, as the afternoon turned into evening, something began to change. A dense fog began to form around the ship, carried by a cool breeze. At first, the crew didn't pay much attention to it. Fog was a natural phenomenon, especially in this area at this time of year. But as night fell, the fog grew thicker, obscuring the horizon and turning the world into an impenetrable gray void. The passengers began to feel uneasy, and the crew decided to take precautions. Chapter 2. The Thick Fog. As the Mariner 2 advanced through the fog, visibility rapidly decreased. Captain Alvarez ordered the ship's speed to be reduced, and all navigation lights were activated. Officers on deck kept a close eye on the radar and communication systems, but soon something unusual happened. The radar began to show strange, erratic readings. "This isn't right," said Communications Officer Thomas Sanchez, his voice tinged with concern. "The systems are starting to fail. The radar is acting up, and the radio signal isn't coming through clearly." Captain Alvarez frowned, his calm demeanor cracking slightly. "Is everything in order with the generators?" he asked. "Yes, but it seems that something is interfering with our systems," Sanchez replied. "Visibility is 0, and we can't see anything through the fog." Captain Alvarez peered out into the dense mist, noting the growing unease among his crew. While fog was a common phenomenon, the atmosphere now felt wrong, unnaturally isolating. Still, he decided to reassure the passengers. "Everything will be fine," he said to his officers. "We'll hold on and ride this out." But the fog didn't relent. Instead, it intensified, enveloping the Mariner 2 in an impenetrable layer that isolated them from the outside world. The soothing sound of the ocean faded, replaced by a profound silence. It was as though the ship had been cut off from the very sea it sailed upon. Chapter 3. Systems Fail. As the night wore on, the Mariner 2's electronic systems began to fail, one by one. The ship's lights flickered, then shut off completely, plunging the vessel into darkness. The engines made a strange metallic noise before sputtering to a halt, leaving the ship adrift in the dense fog. "We've had a problem with the generators," Chief Engineer Juan Fernandez shouted from the control room. "The engines aren't responding." Captain Alvarez felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. "How long can we last without the engines? Can we handle the ship under sail?" "We could manage for a short time, but not much longer," Fernandez replied. "We need to fix the generators. Without power, we can't know what's going on out there." The crew scrambled to regain control, but all their efforts were in vain. The fog remained impenetrable, and even more troubling, there was no wind. The Mariner 2, which would normally be propelled forward by a gentle breeze, now floated motionless. On board, passengers began to notice something wasn't right. Emma, who had been reading in her cabin, emerged into the corridor, drawn by the increasing noise outside. A group of passengers had gathered, whispering in confusion. "What's going on?" Emma asked. "Something strange is happening," Daniel replied, his face pale. "The fog's not clearing, the engines aren't working, and now the ship's gone completely silent." Just then, the loudspeakers suddenly crackled to life. Though no one had activated them, Captain Alvarez's voice echoed through the ship. "Dear passengers, we are experiencing a failure in our systems. Please remain calm. The crew is working on the situation," he said, though there was a faint edge of worry in his voice. But that was the last anyone heard from the captain. The loudspeakers shut off abruptly, and there was no further communication with the crew. The passengers stood frozen, their growing sense of helplessness turning to fear as they realized that the Mariner 2 was trapped in the fog, completely isolated. Chapter 4. The Disappearance. For the next few days, the Mariner 2 remained ensnared in the thick fog. The crew worked tirelessly to send out emergency signals, but all attempts failed. The passengers began to notice something even stranger. Despite the passage of time, it didn't feel like time was moving at all. There was a sense of distortion in the air, as though time itself had become warped. Crew members who tried to go outside to assess the situation were met with a strange vacuum. They couldn't see anything beyond the fog, no ocean, no horizon. It was as if the ship had become suspended in a limbo of dense mist and silence. Days turned into a surreal blur. The faces of the crew members slowly disappeared, as though they were fading from memory. A sense of desolation took hold, and the passengers began to wander the ship aimlessly, unsure of what to do or where to go. Then, after what felt like an eternity, something even stranger occurred. Chapter 5. The Return. A week later, the Mariner 2 emerged from the fog seemingly untouched, just off the coast of Baja California, Mexico. The ship appeared as though it had never been in distress, its systems now fully operational. The passengers, stunned and confused, were in awe as they looked upon the coastline. But as they gathered on deck, they realized something horrifying. The crew was gone. Not a single crew member remained on board. No one knew where they had gone, and the ship's systems were back to normal, operating perfectly. The passengers were rescued by a nearby fishing boat and taken to shore, where they were met with disbelief and confusion. They had no recollection of what had happened during the days they were trapped. Some couldn't remember how they had spent their time aboard. Others had vague, fragmented memories of the fog and the eerie silence. The authorities launched an investigation, but no logical explanation could be found. The ship's logs were empty, and all monitoring systems in the area had detected nothing unusual. The Mariner 2 had disappeared, only to reappear as if nothing had happened. The mystery of the Mariner 2 remained unsolved, a chilling enigma that no one could explain. Chapter 1. The Departure. The sun shone brightly over the Pacific Ocean as the Mariner 2, a sleek, modern tourist cruise ship, set sail from Los Angeles on the morning of May 14, 1997. This luxury ship, with every imaginable amenity, was designed for a perfect vacation. Infinity edge pools, spas, high-end restaurants, and panoramic terraces offering 360 views of the ocean. It was the ideal vessel for a week-long cruise along the Californian coastline. The passengers were a mix of families, couples, and friends, all looking for relaxation and adventure. On the bridge, Captain Victor Alvarez and his crew made final adjustments, preparing for departure. Captain Alvarez was an experienced sailor, respected by his crew and passengers. Among the passengers were Emma, a middle-aged woman traveling alone to escape her daily routine, Daniel and Laura, a young couple on their honeymoon, and a group of friends reuniting for a special occasion. No one could have foreseen the strange events that would unfold. In the first few hours, everything felt perfect. The calm waters, the soothing sound of waves, friendly conversations in the restaurants, and the ocean views created an idyllic atmosphere. For many, it was an escape from the chaos of daily life. But as afternoon turned to evening, something changed. A dense fog began to form around the ship, carried by a cool breeze. At first, the crew didn't worry. Fog was common in these waters at this time of year, but as night fell, it thickened, obscuring the horizon completely. The passengers grew uneasy, and the crew took precautions. Chapter 2. The Thick Fog. As the Mariner 2 advanced, visibility sharply decreased. Captain Alvarez ordered a reduction in speed and activated all navigation lights. Officers kept a close watch on the radar, but soon, strange readings appeared. "This isn't right," said Communications Officer Thomas Sanchez. "The systems are failing. The radar is not functioning, and the radio signal is weak." Captain Alvarez frowned. "Is everything in order with the generators?" "Yes, but something's interfering with the systems," Sanchez replied. "Visibility is zero, and we can't see anything through the fog." Captain Alvarez scanned the horizon, feeling the growing unease of the crew. While fog was natural, the atmosphere now felt wrong, isolating. Still, he reassured the passengers. "Everything will be fine," he said to his officers. "We'll get through this." But the fog only intensified, wrapping the Mariner 2 in an impenetrable layer. The sound of the ocean faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The ship seemed to be suspended in a void. Chapter 3. Systems Fail. As the night wore on, the ship's systems began to fail. The lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the vessel into darkness. The engines made a strange clanking noise before shutting down, leaving the ship adrift in the fog. "We've got a problem with the generators," Chief Engineer Juan Fernandez shouted from the control room. "The engines aren't responding." Captain Alvarez felt panic rising. "How long can we last without the engines? Can we handle the ship under sail?" "We could manage briefly, but not for long," Fernandez replied. "We need to fix the generators, but without power, we can't know what's happening out there." The crew worked frantically, but their efforts were in vain. The fog remained impenetrable, and there was no wind. The Mariner 2, which would normally be carried by a gentle breeze, now floated motionless. Passengers began to sense something was wrong. Emma, who had been reading in her cabin, stepped into the corridor, drawn by shouting. A group of passengers had gathered, whispering in confusion. "What's going on?" Emma asked. "Something strange is happening," Daniel said, his face pale. "The fog's not clearing. The engines aren't working." Suddenly, the loudspeakers crackled to life. Captain Alvarez's voice echoed through the ship. "Dear passengers, we are experiencing a failure in our systems. Please remain calm. The crew is working on it," he said, though there was an undertone of worry. That was the last anyone heard from the captain. The loudspeakers cut out, and there was no further communication. The passengers stood frozen, realizing the ship was trapped in the fog, completely isolated. Chapter 4. The Disappearance. For the next few days, the Mariner 2 remained trapped in the fog. The crew tried to send out emergency signals, but all attempts failed. Passengers began to notice something odd. Despite the passage of time, it felt as though time itself was distorted. Crew members who ventured outside to assess the situation found themselves in a strange vacuum. There was nothing to see, no ocean, no horizon, only endless fog. It was as if the ship had been suspended in a limbo. Days blurred into one another. Crew members began to disappear, and the passengers wandered the ship aimlessly, unsure of what to do. A sense of desolation took hold. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, something even stranger happened. Chapter 5. The Return. A week later, the Mariner 2 emerged from the fog seemingly untouched, off the coast of Baja California, Mexico. The ship appeared as if nothing had happened, its systems fully operational. The passengers, stunned and confused, gazed at the coastline. But as they looked around, they realized the crew was gone. Not a single crew member remained, and no explanation was given. The systems were back online, functioning perfectly. The passengers were rescued by a nearby fishing boat and taken to shore. Confused, they couldn't remember what had happened during their time in the fog. Some couldn't recall how they had spent those days at all, while others had fragmented memories of eerie silence. The authorities launched an investigation, but no explanation could be found. The Mariner 2's logs were empty, and monitoring systems detected nothing unusual. The ship had disappeared, and somehow it had returned. Hours later, the sky was completely dark, and visibility had diminished considerably. The fog had begun to envelop the Borealis, which in these waters was not unusual. As the night progressed, the atmosphere became more and more strange. The fog not only obscured the view but seemed to have an impenetrable density, extending beyond what the eyes could see. Suddenly, the radio emitted static, and the signal cut off abruptly. leaving the crew without contact with the outside world. The navigation systems also showed intermittent failures. The compasses began to move erratically, offering no fixed direction. "Pancho, what's going on?" asked Ramon. "There is no way of knowing where we are," said Ramon, his voice full of bewilderment. "It's just a malfunction." "Let me check the equipment," replied Pancho, though his tone was less confident than he intended. Carlos, the captain's friend, noticed something even stranger. A blue light was glowing faintly in the fog. At first, he thought it was a reflection of the lighthouse or another nearby ship, but as he looked closer, he realized that the light wasn't moving and didn't seem to be coming from any land or sea source. "See that?" Carlos asked, pointing toward the horizon. The others looked and their hearts skipped a beat. The light appeared to be floating in the air, oscillating softly like a flame. It was not a normal light, much less a lighthouse. It was an intense blue glow that swayed strangely, as if singing a melody in the air. "That can't be real," murmured Pedro, Pancho's brother, as he tried to focus his vision. "It's just an optical illusion for sure." "Everyone to their posts," said Pancho, though his voice betrayed growing concern. Despite his attempts to remain calm, the tension was palpable. The light continued to glow in the distance. As the Borealis approached, the fog thickened, enveloping the ship in a near-total blanket. The blue light, now closer, moved slowly toward them, as if calling them. The crew stood silently, observing the phenomenon. Strange sounds began to emanate from the light, a soft tone that seemed to vibrate in their bones. "Is that a voice?" Ramon asked in a whisper. "It's a low, almost musical tone," said Pancho, "but it doesn't seem natural." Some members of the crew began to feel dizzy, as if the vibration of the light was entering their bodies. The rhythm accelerated, and the ship started to move slowly toward the source of the light, as if pulled by an invisible force. Chapter 3. The Abyss. With each passing second, the crew felt more and more trapped in the phenomenon. The fog became denser, and the blue light grew so close that it seemed to envelop them completely. Suddenly, the Borealis was shaken by a strange current from the ship. The ship began to sway violently, and the crew members, gripped by an inexplicable fear, tried to cling to anything that could stabilize them. Pancho shouted someone, but his voice was lost in the wind. For a second that seemed like an eternity, everything stopped. The fog vanished, the blue light disappeared, and the sound ceased. Everything was deathly silent. The crew looked around, completely disoriented. The ocean was as calm as if it had never existed. "Where are we?" asked Pedro, looking around in despair. "This isn't possible," muttered Carlos, looking at the chart, which now seemed completely useless. There were no references, no landmarks. The ship had been dragged into an unknown area beyond any map. Chapter 4. The Return. 3 days passed as the crew struggled to survive without food or fresh water. They began to lose track of time. The worst was hunger and dehydration, but there was something more disturbing: the constant feeling that someone or something was watching them from the shadows of the ocean. On the 4th day, when hope seemed lost, the Borealis emerged from the fog. The crew was weak but alive. The ship was intact, but something had changed. The fog suddenly dissipated, and on the horizon, the coast of Florida appeared in front of them. The exhausted, disoriented crew was found by a nearby fishing boat. The fishermen who rescued them were astonished at the state of the men. Although they were alive, something in their eyes had changed. No one mentioned the lights or the voices, nor the strange sensations they had experienced. However, the story of what had happened spread rapidly through the ports of Miami. The strangest thing of all came days later, when an investigation team tried to explore the area where the Borealis had disappeared. The fog, the sounds, the blue lights, everything had vanished as if it had never existed. The Bermuda Triangle, with its history of mysterious disappearances, had engulfed the crew only to return them inexplicably, without any trace of what had really happened. The 3 points of light. The morning was cool when the Falcon 3 seaplane took off from Nassau Airport in the Bahamas. The clear skies promised a perfect day for the flight. Pilot Max Donovan, an aviation veteran with over 10 years of flying experience, had no reason to suspect that this would be a different kind of flight. At 38, Max was known for his calmness in extreme situations and his impressive ability to stay focused under pressure. The navigation was straightforward, with few clouds in the sky and perfect visibility. The waves of the sea reflected the azure blue of the sky, creating a tranquil scene that seemed to emanate a sense of calmness. However, something strange began to happen as the plane moved northeastward, crossing the waters of the Bermuda Triangle. 2 hours into the flight, Max noticed an anomaly in the navigation instruments. The compass began to spin incessantly, and the radar system stopped showing signals of his position. This was not a common malfunction. Max had experienced small malfunctions before, but this was different. The plane seemed to be affected by something he couldn't identify. He looked out the window and noticed a change in the ocean. The surface, which normally gleamed under the sun, now appeared darker, as if covered by an invisible layer. "I don't like this," he muttered to himself, his concern growing as he adjusted the controls. His mind echoed a single word: triangle. He had heard of the legends of unexplained sightings and mysterious disappearances in this area, but as an experienced pilot, he had always considered them myths. Today, something felt different. As the plane crossed a dense layer of clouds, Max found himself completely disoriented. At that moment, something shimmered in the distance. At first, he thought it was a light from another ship or a nearby island, but as he got closer, he realized the light was unlike anything he had ever seen. 3 points of light shone on the horizon, lined up perfectly in a straight line. The lights emitted an unusual glow, more intense than any natural light source he knew of, pulsing as if breathing a rhythmic pattern. Terrified but intrigued, Max turned the plane toward the lights. He knew something wasn't right, but he didn't have much choice. The radar was still dead, and his compass was useless. It was as if the lights were calling him. He felt an inexplicable need to follow them. As he approached, the lights didn't move randomly. They remained aligned, as if part of some unknown mechanism. The lights pulsed in a way that seemed intentionally controlled. The plane began to fly through a thick fog, a fog that appeared out of nowhere. At first, Max thought he was simply losing course due to the lack of visibility, but soon realized this fog was different. It had no smell, didn't seem to move like typical mist, but hovered, static, enveloping the plane with an eerie stillness. "Where am I?" Max thought, sweat covering his forehead as he struggled to stay conscious. The plane's controls were still erratic, as if something was interfering. Then the mist dissipated as quickly as it had come. What Max saw next was even more disconcerting. The lights were no longer on the horizon. They were right in front of him, so close that he couldn't tell if they were an illusion or a presence. The 3 points of light hovered over the ocean in a seemingly empty space. There was no island, no ship nearby, just the vast ocean below and the strange lights suspended in the air. In an instant, the lights began to move slowly, as if guiding him, marking a path he was to follow. Something inside him, some instinctive part, told him to follow the lights. Max didn't question it further. He simply trusted them. The plane responded to the controls with a fluidity he had never experienced. The sensation of being guided by something greater than himself overwhelmed him. The sea began to calm. The turbulent waters that had surrounded him for hours smoothed out, and the fog disappeared completely. The sun, which had been hidden by clouds, began to shine through the broken cloud cover, illuminating the ocean. After what seemed like an eternity, Max saw a coastline in the distance. He couldn't believe his eyes. He had reached a safe place, a place that could not have been reached without the guidance of those mysterious lights. Finally, with indescribable relief, Max landed at the nearest airport. The plane was intact, and he was exhausted but alive. As he got off the seaplane, one question haunted him. What were those lights? The air traffic controllers assured him that there were no records of storms or unusual phenomena during his flight. No one seemed to understand what had happened. When Max tried to recount his experience, many looked at him skeptically. Some thought he had hallucinated. Others assumed fatigue and stress had impaired his judgment. But Max knew what he had seen. It didn't matter if people didn't believe his story. He had lived it. The experience had changed him in ways he couldn't describe. The lights, the bright spots on the ocean, were no longer just part of a mystery to him. They were the key to something much bigger. The bent horizon. It was a warm summer afternoon when the Maquin's family decided to set sail from the private harbor of their Virgin Islands residence aboard their luxury yacht Sagiron, a vessel with a capacity for 12 people. Charles, the patriarch of the family, his wife Evely, their two teenage children Emma and Lucas, and some close friends had planned a short trip to the nearby islands, a common outing for the family who enjoyed sailing and the tranquility of the sea. The Sagiron was their floating home, a place where they could relax away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Charles, a successful businessman with a passion for the sea, always found solace in the journeys he undertook with his family. Evely, his wife, was a kind and loving woman dedicated to her family and always enthusiastic for new adventures. Emma and Lucas, the teenagers, had grown up in luxury and freedom, but with a strict upbringing that their parents balanced with the family's values. The day began with no indication that anything strange was about to happen. The sky was clear with a gentle breeze that caressed the skin. The sun reflected on the water, creating golden glints that made the ocean look like an infinite mirror. The yacht cut through the water effortlessly. The sound of the engine echoed softly, and the family relaxed as they enjoyed the scenery. Charles was at the helm. Evely was enjoying a glass of wine by the railing, while the children explored the deck, playing and joking. It was a perfect day for sailing, but something felt strange. No one knew exactly what, but everyone had an uneasy feeling, as if the air itself was charged with something inexplicable. As they sailed further out to sea, a bank of fog suddenly appeared like a thick blanket, reducing visibility. Charles decided to slow down and take precautions, though he didn't give it much thought. They were in the open sea, surrounded only by the ocean, and suddenly, a strange sense of disturbance came over everyone on board. It wasn't just the fog that unnerved the family, but a distortion in the horizon. As the yacht glided through the water, the horizon began to change its shape. At first, it was just a sensation, a slight curvature that seemed to move in the distance. But as Sagiron approached, the image became more defined and strange. The horizon began to bend as if the sky and the sea were merging into a curving arc before his eyes. Charles stopped. The sun, still high in the sky, seemed to distort, and the edge of the mist began to swirl, creating a surreal vision as if he was looking into a force field that was bending. Evely let out a gasp of surprise, and the children, who had approached the edge of the deck, stared blankly at what they were seeing. "Daddy, what is that?" asked Emma, her voice full of wonder and fear. "I don't know," replied Charles, his face paling. He couldn't understand what was happening. The horizon now looked like a perfect curve, a rim of light that seemed to bend toward the sky, as if the entire ocean was being sucked toward a distant point. But there was no time to think about it. The strange distortion intensified, and suddenly a gigantic wave came out of nowhere. It was not a normal wave. Its size was inconceivable, as big as a mountain, and it seemed to be traveling in the opposite direction. The wave hit Sagiron with an unstoppable force, overturning the yacht and throwing all the members of the family into the water. The water quickly engulfed the boat, and chaos ensued with screams, jumps into the water, and the deafening sound of the wind, accompanied by the roar of the waves. Charles grabbed a piece of driftwood and struggled to remain calm amidst the terror. Evely and the children were separated from him by the turbulence. The sun was now blocked by dark, turbulent clouds, hidden behind the fog that continued to swirl. The wind seemed to have intensified, and the waves continued their unpredictable path. Charles tried to shout, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the ocean. He could see nothing. The echoes of chaos were overwhelming. No one knew where they were going, or if other ships had seen them, if there was any hope of rescue. Then the lights of a fishing boat became visible in the distance, a tiny shape on the horizon, despite the waves. Charles swam toward it with all his might, shouting in desperation for his family. No matter if the storm was still raging, there was only one thing on his mind: to find his wife and children. Fortunately, the fishing boat, an old vessel with an experienced crew, saw the distress lights that Charles had turned on. As soon as they approached, they found the Maquin's family, exhausted but alive. Yet their story was stranger than anyone could have imagined. We watched as the horizon bent, explained Charles to the fisherman, his voice trembling. It was as if the sea itself was changing, as if reality was distorting in front of us. The fishermen, rough men experienced in the turbulent seas of the Caribbean, exchanged puzzled glances. None of them had ever witnessed anything like this, but they all understood that something beyond ordinary nature had happened. The family was taken aboard the trawler and transported to the nearest port, where doctors and authorities offered them immediate attention. Though they all survived, their bodies were covered with bruises and scratches due to the violence of the storm. But what was most disturbing was their mental state. Evely kept muttering about strange lights shining in the water, while Lucas seemed completely bewildered, as if he couldn't remember what had happened. Although the incident was reported to local authorities, no one could provide a logical explanation for the bent horizon phenomenon. Scientists and experts were perplexed, and investigations yielded no concrete results. Had the Bermuda Triangle phenomenon claimed a new victim, or perhaps something even more inexplicable had been revealed that fateful afternoon? The Sagirin was found days later, miles away from where it had disappeared. The yacht was intact but completely empty. Nobody could understand how or why it had gotten there, and the ocean, as always, kept its secrets. Charles, Evely, Emma, and Lucas, although physically unharmed, were never the same. The vision of the bent horizon and the massive wave would haunt them forever, and they could never escape the strange fear that had taken shape in their hearts. Shadows underwater. It was a calm morning in the crystal-clear waters off the Catalina coast when the Trident Adventures dive team set sail from Abilene Harbor. They were there to explore the wreck of the Helena, a ship that had sunk more than 80 years ago in an accident that had captivated archaeologists for decades. No one really knew what had happened to the Helena, but it was rumored that the ship was carrying a valuable cargo, which attracted explorers seeking not only historical relics but also possible loot. The team consisted of 5 people: the captain of the yacht, Daniel Az, his sister Laura, an expert in underwater archaeology, the lead diver Joe Thompson, the specialist in underwater photography Carla Mendez, and new team member Mark Fitzgerald, an experienced diver but still young in the community. Each had their own reason for being there, but all shared a fascination with the unknown of the sea. The expedition to the wreck began smoothly. The sun was shining, and the visibility in the water was almost perfect. The first few meters of the dive went well. Laura went ahead of the team, pointing out places of interest and taking notes on the Helena structure, while Carla documented with her camera the intricate figures of the submerged hull. Joe, with his experience, swam close to the hull, inspecting areas where the wreck showed signs of structural damage. Mark was in charge of communications and security for the team. The wreck of the Helena was partially buried under a layer of sand and rocks, but many of its details were still intact. Vayman ropes, old anchors, and chaired wooden beams. The site was a diver's paradise. However, when Mark stepped away from the group to take some additional photos of the surroundings, something strange happened. Near one of the holds of the sunken ship, Mark saw something that made him stop. At first, he thought it was a fish or a current passing underneath him, but as he looked more closely, he realized it was a massive figure, something that did not match any marine life he had ever known. It was a large, elongated shadow that slowly glided across the seafloor. His heart began to beat faster as he slowly approached, trying to rationalize what he had seen, but the shadow did not disappear. It seemed to watch him, moving with him every time he shifted. Mark instinctively tried to move away, but the shadow seemed to follow his every step, always by his side. Mark heard Carla's voice through the communicator, but at that moment, a strange pressure on his chest left him breathless. He couldn't stop looking down, and the shadows seemed to get closer. Mark swam back to the group, where he found Joe and Laura, who noticed his nervousness as he approached. Something unsettling happened. The shadow began to move faster, slipping through the dark cracks and crevices of the wreck. The team of divers didn't notice the danger that was lurking in the wreck. They dived deeper into the wreck and headed for the main hold, where they thought they would find artifacts. However, when they reached the bottom of the hull, something eerie became evident. Several shadows moved around the area. Some seemed to fade into the darkness, while others drew closer to the group. They couldn't see them clearly, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It was as if the water itself was alive, reacting to their presence. Joe, the experienced diver, stepped forward. "They're just shadows created by the wreck," he said, trying to reassure them. But his words did little to calm the team. The atmosphere was tense. Something wasn't right, and everyone knew it. Carla, the photographer, tried to take some pictures of the shadows, but when she reviewed the photos, she could not believe her eyes. The shadows were not as blurry as they should have been. They stood out with an unusual clarity. They looked like human forms, huge figures gliding through the water, but they couldn't be fish or marine animals. They were too large. The group began to rise rapidly, but as they did, something strange happened. The water around them darkened even more, as if the sun had gone out, and suddenly, the shadows seemed to move faster, surrounding them, blocking their path to the surface. Something was chasing them. Mark looked back and saw a massive shadow creeping toward them. His body tensed as he realized it was much closer than it had been before. It was a gigantic, completely dark being gliding across the water without a sound. He couldn't see clear details, but the shape was definitely larger than a human being. The communication became chaotic. Joe tried to remain calm, but the pressure of being surrounded by these invisible figures was beginning to consume them. They all swam toward the surface at a dangerous speed, struggling to escape the shadows lurking in every corner of the wreck. The water seemed to be getting denser, as if something in the depths was pulling them down. Finally, the group emerged from the water, gasping for breath. The Trident Adventures yacht was waiting nearby, and Captain Daniel threw them a life preserver with trembling hands. The 5 divers quickly climbed aboard, looking nervously toward the water, fearing that something was waiting for them there. Once on board, Captain Daniel helped them to safety and gave them room to recover. No one said a word for several minutes. The group was visibly upset. Carla, still with her camera, was checking the pictures over and over again, but she couldn't believe her eyes. The shadows in the images seemed all too human, all too aware of their presence. After a few moments, Joe was the first to speak. It wasn't just an illusion. What we saw wasn't natural. Those shadows weren't part of the wreck. Laura, the underwater archaeologist, nodded silently. This isn't something we'd seen before, and it's not just the wreck. There's something in those waters that we don't understand. As the team returned to the harbor, the wind had started to blow harder, and the sea seemed rougher than usual. However, the ocean soon returned to its usual calm, with no signs of what they had just experienced. The storm without time. The eternal freighter Hera Ison was sailing the Atlantic Ocean on a clear night in April 2001, en route from Lisbon to New York, carrying containers of goods, from electronics to furniture. Captain Alan McRae, a seasoned seafarer with decades of experience, confidently led the 18-man crew. The voyage followed the typical rhythm of long hours, night shifts, and the constant hum of the engines. Toward midnight on the 3rd day, the radar began showing unusual signals. These signals accumulated rapidly on the horizon, faster than any weather forecast predicted. While sudden storms weren't uncommon in that region, this one seemed different. The sky turned a dark purple, described by some as unnatural. The storm grew, almost as if it were consciously closing in around the ship. Silent lightning bolts illuminated the sky, but without thunder. In the command room, the ship's clock started behaving erratically. Some sped up, while others stopped completely. The radar showed an empty canvas, no land, no other vessels, just a void where the Hera Ison appeared to be suspended in time. The crew noticed strange changes in the air. There was no wind, though the ocean waves rose ominously. The air was humid, and an absolute silence enveloped the ship, interrupted only by the hum of the engines. Captain McRae ordered the ship to slow, hoping the storm would dissipate, but it only intensified. Around 2:00 a.m., something even stranger happened. The mechanical and digital clocks on board stopped. Seaman Kevin Watts, on watch at the time, noticed his wristwatch's second hand had frozen. The ship's chronometer displayed the same. Other sailors also noticed the phenomenon. and the crew began to realize that time itself appeared to have stopped. As minutes, or what should have been minutes, passed, the men grew confused. Some believed hours had passed, while others felt only moments had elapsed. A sudden flash of light illuminated the ship, and Kevin Watts experienced a strange sensation. He stood still on deck, feeling as if he were frozen in a photograph. He could see, hear, and feel, but couldn't move. Several sailors later reported the same sensation, being trapped in an eternal instant. When motion finally returned, the ship began vibrating, as though something from below was pushing it. The storm seemed to compress around the horizon, the lightning converging toward the water instead of illuminating the sky. Sailors reported seeing humanoid shapes made of light within the electrical discharges, watching them from a distance. Captain McRae tried to maintain control, ordering the crew to stay inside the ship, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. Attempts to use navigational instruments failed. Even the compass spun uncontrollably. The storm reached its peak when a gigantic electrical discharge struck the main mast, briefly illuminating the entire ship with a blue light. Sailors on deck were knocked to the ground, but were miraculously unharmed. It was at that moment that the clocks began ticking again. The ship's electrical systems restarted automatically. However, when the crew checked the navigation system, they discovered they had been stuck in the same spot for over 7 hours without advancing a single meter. The sailors showed signs of exhaustion. Some were dehydrated. Others had more beard growth than they should have, and one claimed his hair had begun to turn gray. When they finally emerged from the storm, the sea was calm, the sky clear. The ship's systems resumed as though nothing had happened, but the crew knew something had changed. When they arrived in New York, they attempted to report the incident, but their accounts were met with skepticism. Despite this, Captain McRae kept a detailed notebook, sketching the luminous figures and researching similar storms for years, though he never found an explanation. McRae later retired, and in an interview years later, he admitted to dreaming of the storm, saying, "It wasn't a normal storm. It was as if something was playing with us, something beyond our comprehension." The horizon continued to sail under another captain, but many of the sailors who had been aboard refused to return to sea. Despite the lack of evidence, the crew members knew they had witnessed something unique, something that would forever remain a part of them. The Forgotten Lighthouse. Sailor Jonathan Eyre had been adrift for days in his small lifeboat after a sudden storm separated him from his fishing crew and destroyed his boat. Desperation was creeping in when, on the 5th morning, he spotted a flickering light on the horizon. It appeared to be a lighthouse, an impossible sight in the middle of the vast ocean. Encouraged, he rowed toward the light, though the current seemed to conspire against him. As he neared, he could make out the silhouette of a tall, sturdy lighthouse built of weathered gray stone, covered in moss and seaweed. The lighthouse stood on a small, rocky island, barely big enough to hold it. Jonathan managed to tie his boat to a rocky outcrop. When he approached the entrance, the door creaked open, revealing a dark interior with saltpeter-covered stone walls. The air smelled of dampness and time. In the center of the main room was a staircase, and Jonathan called out, hoping for a guardian, but his voice echoed unanswered. Exploring the lighthouse, he found a small table covered with old books and journals, some with cracked leather covers and yellowed pages. One journal caught his attention. It described strange storms and unexplained phenomena. One passage in particular stood out. The storm came without warning, like a predator. The sky turned black, and the sea rose in waves that seemed to devour everything. I saw lights in the water, swirling like stars trapped beneath the surface. I tried to signal them from the top of the lighthouse, but they ignored me. Then all was calm, but I know they will return. A chill ran through Jonathan as he read these words. The description of the lights resonated with stories of other sailors lost in the Bermuda Triangle. He continued reading and found that the journals were signed by various people, some dating back to the 19th century. In his search, Jonathan found evidence that someone had lived there long ago. A rudimentary kitchen, rusted utensils, and nautical books with incomplete maps. But there were no recent signs of life. In the upper room where the lighthouse light rotated, He found a telescope pointed toward the horizon and another journal, more recent than the others. One entry from 1952 read, "The lighthouse is trapped at a crossroads, not a place but a time. The storms come and go, but always return to the same point. Today I saw a ship in the distance, but it didn't respond to my signals. Perhaps they no longer exist for us." Jonathan felt uneasy. Was the lighthouse trapped in a time loop, disconnected from the world? After hours of exploring, he'd rested, falling asleep to the sound of the waves. At dawn, he was awakened by the sound of engines. Running to the window, he saw a fishing boat approaching the island. With all his strength, he signaled with a cloth, and the crew spotted him. Once aboard, he tried to explain his experience, but the fishermen told him there was no island or lighthouse in that part of the sea. Jonathan insisted, pointing to the spot where he had paddled, but when they reached the area, the sea was calm and open. Back on the mainland, Jonathan shared his story with maritime authorities, but no records of the lighthouse existed. Despite this, he kept one of the journals from the lighthouse, a tangible reminder of what he had witnessed. Jonathan became obsessed with understanding his experience, researching the Bermuda Triangle, and trying to find connections to his encounter. He never found the lighthouse again, but every time he looked to the horizon, he expected to see that solitary light. His story became a legend among sailors, a cautionary tale about the mysteries of the ocean and the things beyond human understanding. The Mirror of the Sea, Edward, an experienced sailor, had never been superstitious, spending much of his life on the sea exploring unknown routes and confronting its unpredictable furies. But what he experienced in 1974 would change him forever. He set sail from Bermuda in his small sailboat, Health, aiming for Miami, Florida. It was a journey he had made many times before, confident in both his skills and his boat. The first 2 days were calm and almost monotonous, but on the third morning, the wind died. The sea became still, its surface as smooth as glass. Edward had never seen anything like it. The water reflected the sky with eerie perfection, making the horizon seem to vanish. His boat seemed suspended between two infinite skies. Fascinated and disturbed, Edward recorded the phenomenon in his log, describing the water as a perfect mirror. There was no wind, no waves. Everything seemed beautiful but wrong. Hours later, while checking his gear, Edward glanced at the water and froze. Below the boat was an exact replica of the Health, down to every detail, but most disturbing of all, there was a figure on board, someone who looked like him, moving as if he were leaving the ship. Edward tried to convince himself it was just a reflection, a trick of the light. But the more he looked, the more the replica seemed to have a life of its own, sailing with fluidity that didn't match the motionless water. In his diary, he wrote, "I'd have seen something that I cannot explain. It's as if there is another Health sailing with the current, but I do not understand what is happening. Is it a mirage or delirium? But I see it, and it's real." The days stretched on with no wind and no movement. Each one felt endless, and Edward began to lose track of time. The sea was still, the boat trapped in an eerie stasis. Time itself seemed to have stopped. The ship of whispers. It was a warm late summer afternoon when Daniel and Emily Carter set sail on their yacht, Aurora, for a brief getaway from their routine. The voyage was from Key West to Nassau, a route they had traveled before without incident. The Aurora was a modest but reliable sailboat built to withstand rough seas. Daniel, with his sailor's instinct and love for the ocean, was at the helm while Emily managed the maps and supplies. The breeze was light, the waters calm, and everything suggested it would be an uneventful crossing. However, the sea is unpredictable. On the third day, just at sunset, a dense gray fog appeared on the horizon, moving toward them with alarming speed. Daniel and Emily exchanged worried glances. The fog wasn't unusual at sea, but this one felt different. There was no change in atmospheric pressure, and the wind had suddenly stopped, as if the air itself were holding its breath. The fog enveloped them completely in minutes, and Emily turned on the ship's lights, but they barely penetrated the whiteness surrounding them. The outside world disappeared, leaving only the sound of the waves against the hull and the occasional creak of the ropes. "It's strange," Daniel said in an attempt to reassure her. "I don't remember ever seeing such a dense mist." Emily nodded, feeling uneasy. There was something in the air that made her feel watched. Soon, she heard the first whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it was too articulate, like a distant murmur. She stopped dead in her tracks and turned her head toward the water. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Daniel furrowed his brow. "Hear what?" He tried to reassure her, suggesting it was the creaking of the boat or the sound of the water. But then, he heard it too. It was a soft whisper, barely audible but distinctly human, with words that were unclear but rhythmic, as if someone was speaking softly near them. He checked the radar, but it showed no ships nearby. The whispers grew clearer. They said your name. Emily clung to him. "I heard it." Daniel was stunned. The voice had pronounced his name with a tone that was familiar but strange, as if someone nearby was calling him. As the hours passed, the whispers intensified. They weren't just names anymore, but fragments of sentences, questions without context, whispers that seemed to answer thoughts they hadn't even voiced aloud. "Emily, why are you here?" murmured a voice from the water. "Daniel, you can't escape," another voice said. They looked down at the water, but only saw the fog. They tried to use the radio to call for help, but all they heard was static. The GPS and compass failed, and time seemed irrelevant. The sun neither rose nor set, and the fog kept the aurora in a state of perpetual gloom. Exhaustion and dehydration set in, but they couldn't sleep. Every time they closed their eyes, the whispers intensified. After what seemed like days, the fog dissipated as suddenly as it had arrived. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, and the wind returned, stirring the sails. Daniel and Emily looked at each other, relieved but disturbed. However, when they looked around, something was wrong. They had been sailing southeast, but the sun was now in a position that suggested they were much farther north. They consulted the GPS, which had finally started working, and were stunned to find they were hundreds of kilometers off course in an area of ocean they shouldn't have been able to reach, especially with no wind. 2 days after the fog lifted, a Coast Guard vessel sighted the aurora and came alongside to offer assistance. Daniel and Emily, dehydrated and exhausted, but physically unharmed, recounted their experience. The officers listened skeptically, suggesting it was an illusion caused by exhaustion and dehydration. But Daniel and Emily knew what had happened was real. The whispers, the names spoken from the water, and the impossibility of explaining how they had traveled so far in such a short time were too clear in their minds to dismiss as a mere illusion. Back on land, they tried to find answers by speaking with oceanographers, meteorologists, and experts in paranormal phenomena, but no one could offer a satisfactory explanation. Some suggested they had passed through an unknown magnetic phenomenon. Others spoke of parallel dimensions or residual energies in the Bermuda Triangle. Despite the doubts and unanswered questions, Daniel and Emily never returned to the sea. The aurora was sold soon after, and the couple moved inland, away from the ocean. Though they tried to move on, they both knew the sea would never fully let them go. On the quietest nights, when the wind blew at just the right angle, they sometimes thought they heard a distant whisper calling their names, like a lingering echo of the journey they could never forget. The mirror of the sea, Edward, an experienced sailor, had never been superstitious. He had spent much of his life on the sea, exploring unknown routes and confronting its unpredictable furies. But what he experienced in 1974 changed him forever. He set sail from Bermuda in a small sailboat, Health, for a journey to Miami, Florida. It was a route he had sailed many times before, confident in both his skills and his boat. The first 2 days were calm, but on the third morning, the wind died. The sea became still, its surface as smooth as glass. Edward had never seen anything like it. The water reflected the sky with eerie perfection, making the horizon seem to vanish. His boat seemed suspended between two infinite skies. Edward recorded the phenomenon in his log, describing the water as a perfect mirror. There was no wind, no waves, everything seemed beautiful but wrong. Hours later, while checking his gear, Edward glanced at the water and froze. Below the boat was an exact replica of the Health, down to every detail. Most disturbing of all, there was a figure on board, someone who looked like him, moving as if leaving the ship. Edward tried to convince himself it was just a reflection, a trick of the light. But the more he looked, the more the replica seemed to have a life of its own, sailing with fluidity that didn't match the motionless water. In his diary, he wrote, "I'd have seen something that I cannot explain. It's as if there is another health sailing with the current, but I don't understand what is happening. Is it a mirage or delirium? But I see it, and it's real." The days stretched on, with no wind and no movement. Time itself seemed to have stopped. On the fifth day of being trapped in the mirrored sea, Edward was on the verge of collapse, weakened by dehydration. When he saw a dot on the horizon, he thought at first it was a hallucination. But as it got closer, he realized it was a merchant ship. With his last strength, he lit a flare. The crew saw it and swerved to rescue him. Once aboard, Edward could barely speak. They gave him food and water and listened to him explain what had happened. "There was a boat under the water," he muttered with a broken voice. "It was my boat. It was me." The sailors exchanged looks of disbelief but didn't press in further. They took him to the medical room where he rested for hours. When he finally regained enough strength to speak clearly, he tried to convince them to return to the spot where he had been trapped. But when the merchant ship arrived in the area, the sea was rough, and there was no sign of the calm or the mysterious reflection. Edward could never forget his experience. When he arrived in Miami, he recounted it to maritime authorities, but his story was met with skepticism, some suggesting it was a delusion brought on by dehydration and isolation, others blaming extreme stress amplified by the loneliness of the ocean. But Edward knew what he had seen was real. He spent the rest of his life searching for answers, reading about phenomena related to the Bermuda Triangle, and speaking to other sailors who had encountered strange things in the region. They often spoke of what he called the mirror of the sea, a phenomenon where the world seems to split into two, one real, the other inverted. Edward never sailed alone again, fearing the reflection would return. Until the end of his days, he kept a drawing in his notebook of health floating on the surface of a still sea, with its exact replica sailing calmly in the depths. It remained a reminder of his encounter with the unexplainable, trapped in the ocean's glass.